Finally, we get to the book. As I mentioned earlier, the book came near the end of the journey. After the story had been presented at the History Open House 2014, it was clear there was lots of interest in the story from the general public. The genre of true crime never held any interest for me, so I had not considered doing a book about a murder. However, in this new context, I started to think that a book might be possible. I contacted Beth Bruder, who had a cottage at Presqu'île Point, and I knew was vice president of Dundurn Press in Toronto. Beth had been to the History Open House and was well aware of our history work around Brighton. I asked her if it would be possible to publish a book about the Dr. King story, and she was very receptive to the idea. Now I needed to look at the story again, and this time with the idea of creating a full-size book. I went back to my original text from a few months before and developed from there. By April, I had a manuscript that I felt confident about, so I passed it along to Beth. This was my first book. In fact, I had never worked with an editor before. Frankly, I had trepidations about how that might work. On that subject, Beth gave me some very good advice. She said that when you work with editors, you leave your ego at the door. That was excellent advice. And in the end, I had no problem working with editors. But now I had to get down to the serious nuts and bolts of writing a book. This was my first, so I had no blueprint or prescribed plan. What I did have was two important objectives, both which were important to me. First, it had to be a history story, not historical fiction. I had all these documents, which for a history geek like me told the story to me. I knew that in order to create a proper history story, I would need to deal with notes and references, which would make the process much more complex and difficult. Second, I wanted people to enjoy reading the book. What's the use of all that work if it sits on a shelf and nobody reads it? I knew from experience that readers respond to good stories, or more correctly, good stories told well. This meant that I needed to create a narrative approach that tells a real history story but reads easily, so it seems like a novel. Frankly, these two ideas were top of mind for me as I watched the book go through all the stages of editing and proofing and finally made its way out into the world. One decision I had to make about the book was the subject of the dedication. In fact, it was a simple decision. The dedication reads, "In memory of my grandfather, Lloyd Ames, who loved to tell stories from the past. He hated the Dr. King story, but with prodding eventually told me what he knew about it. Some of my interest in history comes from long visits with grandfather at Codrington and from his passionate retelling of family lore. Today, I imagine he might have grumbled about the topic of my book, but I expect he also would have been one of the first at the library to check it out." That brings us to the release date, June 25th, 2015. At Lighthouse Books in beautiful downtown Brighton. The book was well received, and the feedback suggested that my objectives had been met. Some folks said that they could not put the book down once they started. "Reads like a novel," others said. For me, it was a big sigh of relief. I must acknowledge the support of two wonderful ladies in the context of the Dr. King book. Dot Conley was very supportive throughout the entire process, all the research, analysis, and story design, as well as simply providing a good sounding board for ideas. Also, Beth Bruder was instrumental in having the book published and has been very supportive since then. The three of us attended an event in Toronto put on by Dundurn Press in January 2016, where we were hobnobbing in the publishing world. Beth Bruder retired from Dundurn and, lucky for me, was available to act as publishing consultant for my third book, The Wreck of HMS Speedy. This lady knows the publishing world and has been extremely helpful in moving my work ahead. Thanks very much, both Dot and Beth. Applefest was lots of fun in September 2015. I sold a lot of books that day and was amazed at the support and encouragement I received from many people who stopped at my booth. This would carry on for the next several years. My second book, 38 Hours to Montreal, was added in 2018. And then my third book, The Wreck of HMS Speedy, in 2020. Actually, I have had a booth on Main Street for Applefest from 2004, until COVID canceled everything in 2020. However, we are back in business with Applefest 2022. Release of the book led to a lot more speaking engagements, which have persisted and grown since then. Provost Clubs of Canada have me near the top of their preferred speakers list, and clubs from across the province ask me for a new story each year. It's sometimes hard for me to believe, but it turns out I'm a storyteller. Who knew? During the pandemic, I did a lot of virtual speaking events. Of course, it's not as good as being there in person, but Zoom works great, and it allowed me to keep my hand in with storytelling. During the summer of 2021, most events were still shut down, except for the farmers' markets. So I focused on the markets at Codrington, Trenton, and Cobourg. This was hard work, but I had a lot of fun, talked to lots of people, and sold a lot of books. In 2022, I have been a vendor only once a month at the markets in Codrington, Cobourg, and Wellington. I'm still selling lots of books, talking to lots of people, but on a much reduced schedule. Interestingly enough, Murder in the Family remains popular in both sales and interest. People who have read the book often stop and tell me how much they enjoyed it. Often they encourage their friends to buy the book for just that reason. For those who love true crime stories, this book is a rare find because it is also a real history story. However, they will often tell me to stop talking because they want to discover the story for themselves. For any author, this is all good news. In fact, I have to say that I am extremely satisfied that the story is now out in the world and that it has been well received. My dad and my grandfather may curl their nose at the topic, but I think they would be pleased with the way the story has been told. Thanks very much for watching Journey to Murder in the Family. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to look at my website, www.danbuchananhistoryguy.com, for more information about my books, my upcoming events, and many stories I have provided in the history section. The book, Murder in the Family, The Dr. King Story, was published by Dundurn Press and is distributed by University of Toronto Press. That means it is widely available in bookstores and libraries. E-book versions of this book, as well as my other two, can be ordered on various online bookstores. Of course, I always want to give a shout out to our wonderful local bookstore in Brighton, Lighthouse Books on Main Street. All of my books are available for sale there, usually signed copies. Tell them Dan sent you. These days, I look back at my move to Brighton in 2010 and figure it was one of my best decisions. Brighton is a great place to be the history guy. Thank you.